Departing Ruby Valley Station, our route lay over a long divide, cold but not unpicturesque, a scene of light-tinted mountain mahogany, black cedar, pure snowy hill, and pink sky. After 10 miles, we reached the place where the road forks. That to the right, passing through Pine Valley, falls into a gravelly ford of the Humboldt River, distant from this point 80 to 85 miles. After surmounting the watershed, we descended over a benchland into a raw and dreary plain in which greasewood was more plentiful than sagebush. Huntington Valley is traversed by Smith's Fork, which flows northward to the Humboldt River. When we crossed it, it was a mere rivulet. Jacob's Well is noted by many sources as a Pony Express station. The station did not exist when Richard Burton passed through the area on October 8, 1860, but it probably went up a short time later or as part of the Overland Mail Company. General Frederick Jacobs and a crew of men dug a well and erected a small stone structure that served as a stop for both Pony Express riders and the Overland Mail Company line. Very little, if any, evidence of the station remains at the site today. Our camping ground was at the farther end of the plain, under a pass called after the chief Chocop, known today as Overland Pass. The canyon emitted a cold draught, like the breathing caves of Kentucky. We alighted at a water near the entrance and found bunch grass besides a little fuel. After 2 hours, the wagon came up with the stock, which was now becoming weary, and we had the usual supper of dough, butter, and coffee. I should have slept comfortably enough upon a shovel and a layer of carpet bags had not the furious south wind howled like the distant whooping of Indians. To the wilderness again, 9th October. The frosty night was followed by a thaw in the morning. We hastened to ascend Chocop's Pass by a bad, steep dugway. It lies south of Railroad Canyon, which is said to be nearly flat-soled. A descent led into moonshine, called by the Utahs Pahanap Valley, and we saw with pleasure the bench rising at the foot of the pass. The station is named Diamond Springs, from an eye of warm but sweet and beautifully clear water bubbling up from the earth. A little below it drains off into a deep rushy ditch with a gravel bottom containing equal parts of comminuted shells. We found it an agreeable and opportune bath. Hard work had begun to tell upon the temper of the party. The judge, who ever preferred monologue to dialogue, aweary of the rolling prairies and barren plains, the bald and rocky ridges, the muddy flats, saleratus ponds, and sandy wastes, sighed monotonously for the woodland shades and the rustling of living trees near his Pennsylvania home. The marshal, with true Anglo-American impetuosity, could not endure Paddy Kennedy's slow and sure style of travel, and after a colloquy in which the holiest of words were freely used as adjectives, participles, and exclamations, offered to fight him by way of quickening his pace. The boys, 4 or 5 in number, ate for breakfast a quarter of beef, as though they had been Kaffirs or Eskimo, and were threatened with ration cutting. The station folks were Mormons, but not particularly civil. They afterward had to fly before the savages, which perhaps they will be pleased to consider judgment upon them. Diamond Springs, today the site of a station, sits on private land. The limestone slab section of the original Pony Express station, still partially standing among large cottonwoods at the mouth of Telegraph Canyon. Diamond Springs, overgrown with cattail and salt grass, is located in the meadow nearby. There's another stone dugout among the trees, but no one knows how long it has been there. The structures are visible from the country road on the west side of the Diamond Mountains. There's a brass Pony Express centennial plaque mounted in a stone and concrete monument near the ranch house, just 1 mile south of the actual station site. One source mentions that Diamond Springs received its name from Jack Diamond, a miner and prospector. Edna Patterson lists the station keeper as William Cox during the Pony Express era. Cox remained at Diamond Springs when the Overland Telegraph arrived and served as telegraph operator and maintenance man for stations between Cherry Creek and Roberts Creek. Shortly after noon, we left Diamond Springs and carried on for a stretch of 7 miles to our lunching ground. A rushy water, black where it overlies mud, and bluish green where light gravel and shells form the bottom. The taste is sulphury, and it abounds in confervas and animalcule like leeches and little tadpoles. Sulphur Springs is commonly listed as a Pony Express station. However, it could not have been one of the original stations built in the spring of 1860. In reviewing the literature, there's no mention of this station prior to the Overland Stage and Mail Express maps of 1863. Sulphur Springs was probably built in July of 1861 to facilitate the opening of the Overland Stage. Since it was on, or at least near, the Pony Express route, it was probably used as a way station for horse changes from the time of the station's inception to the demise of the pony. It was used as an overland stop until 1869. After playing a tidy bowie knife, we remounted and passed over the rough divide lying westward of Moonshine Valley. As night had closed in, we found some difficulty in choosing a camping place. At length, we pitched upon a parelion under the lee of a hill, where we had bunch grass and fuel, but no water. The wind blew sternly through the livelong night, and those who suffered from cramps and cold feet had little to do with the sweet restorer, balmy sleep. At 6 a.m., the mercury was sunk only to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, but the elevation and rapid evaporation, with a fierce gusty wind coursing through the canyon, rendered the sensation of cold painful. As usual on these occasions, George, our chef, sensibly preferred standing over the fire and enwrapping himself with smoke to the inevitable exposure incurred while fetching a coffee pot or a tea kettle. A long divide with many ascents and descents at length placed us in front of a view of the normal distance, heaps of hills white as bridal cakes, and nearer a sand-like plain somewhat more yellow than the average of those salt bottoms. Instinct told us that there lay the station house. From the hills rose the smokes of Indian fires. The lands belonged to the Tushwichya, or White Knives, a band of Shoshones under an independent chief. This depression is known to the Utahs as Shiwit, or Willow Creek. The whites call it, from Mr. Bolivar Roberts, the western agent, Roberts Springs Valley. It lies 286 miles from Camp Floyd. From this point, Simpson's Road strikes off to the southeast. And as Mr. Howard Egan's rule here terminates, it is considered the latter end of Mormondom. Like all the stations to the westward, that is to say, those now before us, it was burnt down in the late Indian troubles and has only been partially rebuilt. One of the employees was Mr. Mose Wright of Illinois, who again kindly assisted me in correcting my vocabulary. About the station loitered several Indians of the White Knife tribe, which boasts, like the old Sioux and the modern Flatheads, never to have stained its weapons with the blood of a white man. They may be a respectable race, but they are ugly. They resemble the diggers, and the children are not a little like juvenile baboons. The dress was the usual medley of rags and rabbit furs. They were streaked with vermilion, and their hair, contrary to and more sensibly than the practice of our grandfathers, was fastened to a frontal pigtail to prevent it falling into the eyes. These men attended upon the station and herd the stock for an occasional meal, their sole payment. They will trade their skins and peltries for arms and gunpowder, but, African-like, they are apt to look upon provisions, beads, and tobacco in the light of presents. Roberts Creek was one of the original Pony Express stations built in the spring of 1860. It is difficult to say whether Bolivar Roberts or Howard Egan built the Roberts Creek. Some accounts say Bolivar Roberts and his crew built stations as far east as Roberts Creek. However, Burton says Roberts Creek was the westernmost extent of Egan's division. It seems that the station was still intact around May of 1860. After this time, it is thought that the station was destroyed by Indians, and Bolivar Roberts set out to rebuild destroyed stations and restock them. This time the buildings were better constructed and men left to occupy each one until the Indian troubles were over. On June 16, they met Howard Egan at Roberts Creek. Roberts Creek Station was a telegraph station as well as an overland stage station. It was an overland stop until 1869. A long march of 35 miles lay before us. Kennedy resolved to pass the night at Shewitt Creek, and despite their grumbling, sent on the boys, the stock, and the wagons, when rested from their labor in the early afternoon. We spent a cozy, pleasant evening, such as I have enjoyed in the old Italian days before railroads. A traveler's tittle and Munchausen tattle in the dingle corner, and round the huge hearth of the half-finished station with its holy walls. At intervals, the roarings of the wind, the ticking of the death watch, a well-known xylophagus, boring a home in the soft cottonwood rafters, and the bowlings of the Indians who were keening at a neighboring grave, formed a rude and appropriate chorus. Mose Wright recounted his early adventures in Oregon, how, when he was a greenhorn, the Indians had danced a war dance under his nose and then set upon his companions. After slaying them, had displayed their scalps. He favored us with a representation of the ceremony, an ursine performance. The bear seems everywhere to have been the sire of Terpsichore. While the right hand repeatedly clapped to his lips, quavered the long, loud howl into broken sounds. We talked of a curious animal, a breed between the dog and the bear, which represents the semi-fabulous Jumard in these regions. It is said to be a cross, far more savage than that between the dog and the wolf. The young grizzly is a favorite pet in the western hut, and a canine graft is hardly more monstrous than the progeny of the horse and the deer lately exhibited in London. I still believe that in Africa, and indeed in India, there are accidentally mules bimagnus and quadrimagnus, which would suggest that such specimens should be sought as the means of settling on a rational basis the genus and species of Homo sapiens. Mose Wright described the Indian arrow poison. The rattlesnake, the copperhead and moccasin he ignored, is caught with a forked stick planted over its neck and is allowed to fix its fangs in an antelope liver. The meat, which turns green, is carried upon a skewer when wanted for use. The flint head of an arrow, made purposefully to break in the wound, is thrust into the poison, and when withdrawn, is covered with a thin coat of glue. Ammonia is considered a cure for it, and the Indians treat snake bites with the actual cautery. The rattlesnake here attains a length of 8 to 9 feet and is described as having reached the number of 73 rattles, which, supposing, as the theory is, that after the 3rd year it puts forth 1 per annum, it would raise its age to that of man and is much feared in Utah Territory. We were also cautioned against the poison oak, which is worse than the poison vine east of the Mississippi. It is a dwarf bush with quercine leaves, dark-colored and prickly like those of the holly. The effect of a sting or a touch, or it is said in sensitivities to proximity, is a painful itching, followed by a rash that lasts 3 weeks, and other highly inconvenient consequences. Strong brine was recommended to us by our prairie doctor. Among the employees of the station was an intelligent young mechanic from Pennsylvania who, threatened with consumption, had sought and soon found health in the pure regions of the Rocky Mountains. He looked forward to revisiting civilization where comforts were attainable. In these wilds, little luxuries like tea and coffee are often unprocurable. A dudeen or cutty pipe sells for $1. Consequently, a hollowed potato or corn cob with a reed tube is often rendered necessary. The tobacco must be mixed with myrtaceous leaf, called by the natives timaya, and by the mountaineers larp, possibly a corruption of la herb or la yerba. Newspapers and magazines arrive sometimes twice a year, when they have weathered the dangers of the way. Economy has deprived the stations of their gardens, and the shrinking of immigration, which now dribbles eastward instead of flowing in full stream westward, leaves the exiles to amuse themselves. To Dry Creek, 11th October. We arose early and found that it had not frosted, that flies were busy in the station house, and that the snow, though thick on the northern faces, had melted from the southern shoulders of the hills. These were so many indices of St. Martin's or Indian summer, the last warm glow of life before the cold and pallid death of the year. At 6 a.m. we entered the ambulance and followed a good road across the remains of the long, broad Chouette Valley. After 12 miles we came upon a water surrounded by willows, with dwarf artemisia beyond. It grows better on the benches where the subsoil is damper than in the bottoms. And there we found our lazy boys, who, as Jim Gilston said, had been last night on a drunk. Resuming our way, after 3 miles, we reached some wells whose alkaline water chapped the skin. Camp Station, or Grubb's Well, commonly mentioned in the public lists of Pony Express Station, and is also listed with Overland Stage Station. However, there was no station at the site in the fall of 1860. It was in existence by August 1861, and the pony ran until October of 1861. In July of 1861, John Butterfield began his overland mail and stage express and freight service just prior to the demise of the Pony Express. He ran his stage fairly closely along the Pony Express route, but he built some additional stations along the route. Grubb's Well was probably built in July of 1861 for the overland stage. In 1861, the station was a teepee-like structure with rough poles covered by rushes and grass. It was fresh milk from a rare milk cow kept by the hostler. The well here was only 10 feet deep and was open to anyone who would haul the harshly alkaline water. 20 miles further led to the west end of the Shuet Valley, where we found the station on a grassy bench at the foot of low rolling hills. It was a mere shell with a substantial stone corral behind, and the inmates were speculating upon the possibility of roofing themselves in before the winter. Water is found in tolerable quantities below the station, but the place deserved its name, Dry Creek. Gilston, the employee, was an intelligent man. At San Francisco he had learned a little Chinese, and at Deep Creek he was studying the Indian dialects. He had missed making a fortune at Carson Valley, where in June or July 1859 the rich and now celebrated silver mines were discovered. He warned us against the danger of tarrying in Carson City, where revolvers are fired even into houses known to contain ladies. Colonel Totten, the station master, explained the formation of the gold diggings as beds of gravel from 1 to 120 feet, overlying slate rock. Dry Creek Station is on the eastern frontier of the Western Agency, as at Roberts Creek, supplies and literature from Great Salt Lake east and Carson City west are usually exhausted before they reach these final points. After a frugal feed, we inspected a grave or two, which bore the names of Lossier and Applegate, and the date 21st of May. These men, employees of the station, were attacked by Indians, Panax or Shoshone, or possibly both. The former was killed by the first fire. The latter, when shot in the groin and unable to proceed, borrowed under pretext of defense a revolver, bade goodbye to his companions, and put a bullet through his own head. The remainder then escaped. Both these poor fellows remain unavenged. The Anglo-American, who is admirably protected by officials of his government in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and systematically neglected, Teste Mexico, in America. The double grave, piled up with stone, showed gaps where the wolves had attempted to tunnel. The blue bottle flies were buzzing over it in expectation. Colonel Totten, at our insisted, promised that they would be looked to. The night was comfortably passed at Dry Creek under the leeward side of a large haystack. The weather was cold but clear and bright. We slept the sleep of the just. Dry Creek Station, being the last of the original Pony Express stations on the Bolivar Roberts Division, was most likely built by his crew in that spring of 1860. The transcontinental telegraph was rapidly being constructed in 1861. As fast as outer stations were established, the important news of the day was sent to them by wire and transferred to the Pony Express. This meant that, so far as telegraphic communications were concerned, the Pony Express was playing a constantly lessening role. The newspapers, in introductory lines which were significantly descriptive, told of the progress of the telegraph across the country. Thus, the San Francisco Bulletin of August 13, 1861, said the Pony Express rider was leaving his dispatches for the Bulletin and other Pacific Coast newspapers at Dry Creek Station. Dry Creek was used by the Overland Stage and Mail Company as a stop from 1861 to 1869. It was from Dry Creek west that the stage route and the Pony Express route differed slightly. The Pony traveled almost directly westward from here to the north of Eagle Butte and on to Simpson Park. The stage went south around Cape Horn and then west. An additional station on the Overland, Cape Horn Station, was built on this longer route that was no longer needed by the Pony. Hubert Howell Bancroft indicated that because of Indian troubles, every station as far east as Dry Creek and Simpson Park were broken up during the Pyramid Lake War. To Simpson's Park, 12th of October, at the time of the cold, clear dawn, whose gray contrasted strongly with the blush of the most lovely evening that preceded it. The mercury stood at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Shortly after 8 a.m., we were afield, hastening to finish the long divide that separates Roberts Creek Valley from its western neighbor, which, as yet unchristened, is known to the boys as Smoky Valley.